Annika and I have been working together for several months, and we're really delighted to bring this to you today and to share it with you. And hopefully, with some time at the end where we can all sort of discuss how this is relevant to you where you are. So, backyard habitats becoming conservation corridors. We're going to begin with the big picture of a conservation corridor and bring it down over the course of this hour to the backyard. But first, if there's anyone here from some other continent, definitely put that in the chat, please. If you are joining us from a desk and you're usually teaching outside, and this is just the weirdest thing, you can mention that, but go ahead and introduce yourselves if you want in the chat, so you can get to know each other. Feel free to put your contact information there, and maybe folks will be able to connect into the future. That's what networking is, what conferences are all about. I do want to recognize that somebody said shout out to TSS. I'm going to just repeat that one more time for graduate school. That's what the pre-program is focused on. And because there are only about 15 students in that program, with I think an average about 5 professors, at least that's the way it was in '95, you have just a profoundly intense and beautiful learning experience in one of the greatest ecosystem places on earth in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So definitely look into it if you're thinking about grad school. Also, I wanted to let you know that I, kind of like others in this conference, I flamed my fire for outdoor ed out west in the Wind River Range, which we heard at the beginning of the conference. That seems to be sort of a birthplace for a lot of environmental educators. It seems the Noel Lees and others. But when I was out there, I also felt this pretty strong sense that I needed to go back to a place, to my home. And I had been in North Carolina. I was going to go back to North Carolina. And E.O. Wilson talks about biophilia, a love of a land. And I understood that not because of being in the winds, but because I grew up on a farm. And I'm emotional, just like the opening speaker, but I really connected to that place as a kid. And when we were out in the winds and out at TSS, we would always say the real work is back home in our neighborhoods. When COVID hit, despite the tragedy of it, I saw it as this rocking opportunity, as so many of us did, to go back to our roots with place-based education and to help people who are already walking outside because they had nowhere else to go, as was said, to truly reconnect or initially connect with place. So Danica and I have been working on sort of since it hit. So let's begin with a large scale in case, which I doubt is true, but in case the whole concept of a conservation corridor is new, we have a short video for you. And also it's a highlight of E.O. Wilson, and we have it on a website. We'll show that to you later on. So let me share my screen and just kind of play a little bit of that. Again, so we get context. And Danica, maybe you can text me separately if somehow the audio isn't working.
It is sounding a bit foggy, right?
Can you hear it?
I can't hear it.
Darn it. Okay. Danica, could you play it? I'll stop sharing.
Yes.
Thank you.
Here we go, everybody. Plan B. Share screen. Gotta have a plan B when you present at your first conference. Just share everything, but co-present for one thing. Never want to do this without CC. And for another thing, share everything with each other. So when it doesn't work for one, the other one can do it. Okay, here we go. Hold on, I'm just going to get it to the right spot here.
These monkey animals, with the species dying out.
Okay.
Amazon experiment sounded an alarm. It showed that shrinking a habitat has a greater effect on larger animals.
All right, can everybody hear that? It's about to get to our section here. Okay.
Conservationists elsewhere, such as in the Rocky Mountains, we're also discovering just how much area some animals need.
So we had this wolf called Pluie the wolf. She started just below Banff National Park and she moved 100,000 square kilometers. She moved across 2 provinces, 3 states, 30 different jurisdictions. It was that kind of movement of animals that caused conservationists and scientists to go, wow, we're not really thinking at the right scale.
Biologists realized that even national parks might not be big enough to support species with large home ranges.
Wildlife, particularly bigger animals, they need room to roam. Well, they can't do that if there's too many human activities and if they don't have the ability to move through that sea of humanity.
But if protected areas are hemmed in, how can you make them any bigger?
I work for an organization that's called the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. It was founded in 1993 with a vision of connecting and protecting habitat from down in Wyoming all the way to the Arctic Circle in the Yukon, a 3,200 kilometer stretch of land.
One way Y2Y reconnects existing protected habitats is by purchasing land to create a wildlife corridor, a larger continuous wilderness through which animals can move.
Our challenge in order to conserve these species over the long term is to make sure that we resolve those potentially fragmenting areas and try and reconnect them and keep them connected.
Another important way to link habitats is taking place on indigenous land in western Montana.
We're here at the south end of the Flathead Indian Reservation. This is the area where Highway 93 cuts through a really continuous block of forested area. Highway 93 is a pretty big barrier with a lot of traffic. And so previously, animals had to try to run across this highway.
The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, with the wildlife biologists here, successfully lobbied for the construction of bridges and passages to connect habitats severed by Highway 93.
We're in a really unique area because we have the overpass over here that allows animals to walk over the highway. And then we also have associated underpasses here that let species walk under. Now that we've come into the underpass, the sound is different. The traffic volume is kind of loud, but when you get in here, it's muffled. It's not as loud. You can hear the creek running through the middle. It sounds more natural. In the middle of the summer, wildlife will just lay in these things for hours. They'll be drinking water. They'll just be resting. They can see things coming toward them, so they have some ability to see predators approaching, and it's just kind of cozy for now. A crossing structure like this makes a connection between those 2 patches of land so that animals can move through. It essentially makes them one big area.
Tracking
Okay,
which animals
let's
use
see.
them
I'm going
is
to
a
pause
measure of
it
the project's
here.
success.
And Cece, I'm going to stop my share and turn it back over to you. Cece, you are muted.
There we go.
There we go.
Woohoo! All right, y'all. So we're trying to keep this mixed up a little bit to keep it interesting with videos and websites and so forth. Right here, you're looking at the landscape conservation cooperatives. And what you should see, is there anyone here, you could put it in the chat, who's not from the Southeast? Here, I've got the Southeast is highlighted. But we were just talking about the greater Yellowstone ecosystem going on up. Danica, you can let me know because I can't see the chat. But what you're looking at right now, if you see my map, are all of these different landscape conservation cooperatives that have come together, and they're thinking across the geopolitical boundaries, right? North Carolina, South Carolina, that means nothing to a wolf or a coyote. But this does mean something. These contiguous pieces of land have characteristics in common, and they act as corridors. That is a tool I want you to know that exists. So you start there, that's the biggest scale, and then you start zeroing in. So here's where I live in the Southeast, and this is my landscape conservation cooperative. And that little dot right there is my house. So if you go in, I can start to look at the land, and I can see now that in the Southeast Cooperative, you can see the corridors. I don't know if you can see my cursor. The corridors on this map are gray, often they're the impervious surfaces, but the corridors are showing us this is our best chance, our best opportunity of how to create connectivity on the landscape. The purple is showing us where it's already rich. I happen to know there's an endangered species in that creek right there in the deep river, the Cape Fear shiner, and that's why that's protected. But I can now see as I go in that there's a corridor of connectivity right here that we're trying to work on. So I can influence my neighbors, and I can think about my landscape here and become part of a local solution for habitat connectivity. So right here behind 3M, that's a really, which is, I know this is a mine, that's a really important space for us to make sure we communicate with developers, the community, the county commissioners about habitat connectivity right here in terms of our corridors. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, we have these large scale solutions, but how do we get that handled on a tiny scale? And the way that we're going to do that is by using the existing tools that are out there that have been handed to us by multiple people that Danica will introduce you to more as we get a little deeper in. But let me just give you a little more context. This is a quote that I came across when I was at TSS, and it didn't make a lot of sense. But we kept saying, these students are coming to us from Boston to Washington, you know, that whole megalopolis. And they have these amazing experiences in the Wind River Range or up in the Boundary Waters, but they're going home. And how do you make a difference back home? And I found this quote. It was actually from North Carolina. And I was like, I don't really understand this. I haven't ever lived this, but something about it feels right. This quote is actually a scan of the paper that hangs in my kitchen. And I'm still working on it. Still working on being here, well, in my place. And Ptolemy is giving me some tools to do that work. His second book, Nature's Best Hope, talks about how we have millions of acres in private land. And how are we going to take advantage of that? It's an opportunity to collectively decide how to return at least half of that land to a more natural state. E.O. Wilson talks about half Earth, and Ptolemy talks about half your backyard. And they actually connect. So those two concepts. The new approach to conservation begins in your yard, and he describes his vision in his book. This habitat connectivity is not a new concept. Natural riparian corridors exist in North Carolina along our creeks and our rivers. There are other kinds of corridors. Humans create them like greenways, overpasses, underpasses like we saw in the video. And there are different needs. As you can see even here, interior forest species, they're even common species. They have different needs within those corridors. Some of them can't tolerate the presence of humans. So again, not all corridors are natural. These are intentional creations right here by communities that recognize the importance of connectivity over, you know, habitat fragmentation. And this that you're looking at is a tool from something called the Green Growth Toolbox in North Carolina that you can find on the wildlife website. And it tells more about how humans can live well in habitat, but we can plan the green before the gray being impervious development surfaces. So along this riparian corridor, the needs of the species that use the highway vary. And once again, they've created these nodes so that those sensitive species can have more interior spaces, the ones that can't tolerate the presence of humans. The nodes provide the places to exit the highway, to hide and hunt and make a home. They also have these connected neighbors that are talking to each other that have dedicated sections of their yard to this corridor. And it's a win-win because those houses, they sell for more money. And the people, if they're not mowing and blowing, they can actually hear bird songs and frogs calling. And those yards live amidst other yards that back up to wild spaces. And if you set aside critical habitat and then you build these corridors between the wild spaces with the greenways or the land trusts and targeting those purchases, then you're helping wildlife populations move and mingle, which of course results in resilience in those populations. And now you've got E.O. Wilson's island biogeography, or, bifurcated habitat, is overcome because we have these corridors that are there. So half yard becomes part of half earth. Ideally, we're going to influence our neighbors, and together we're going to work on this microcosm of our communities to shift the story. I want to note here, this is an old version, and I have changed this slide, and I've taken out all those very Anglo names, and I've put in different identities of different ethnic names, but I didn't get the right slide in here. But I would recommend not putting in all those Euro names. Because we're all different and we're all trying to live together, and that's part of the problem, right? That culture in a place, like that quote from Gary Snyder, so important, because neighbor to neighbor, we are a warring species, right? We cause fights better than anybody, and that trying to get along with your neighbors is some of the hardest get along there is, right? So anyway, ideally, we'll influence our neighbors, we'll work together in these microcosms of our communities, and we will shift that story for wildlife at the local landscape scale. It's time to redefine what a yard is. Home, grass, and sunlight could be replaced by canopy and moss and fungi. And then you get visitors you might not even expect, even here in the microstesium, which is a non-native. I went out and found this with my kids in the spring. And that is our suggestion for a winning strategy. So what I want to do now is pass it over to Danica, because she's going to tell you her story. And it was really wonderful to work with her because she sort of took this concept and applied it in a way and that I totally didn't expect. It was really remarkable. And she's going to show you those tools. So she's such a teacher. Thank you, Danica.
Thank you, Cece. Hey, everybody. I'm really excited to see some of you who messaged me or who posted pictures and questions in the app. Just makes it really fun to be at a conference like this when we're able to connect beforehand, and hopefully we can connect after this as well. Like Cece said, I want to share my story with you, but there's really a purpose to this story. I want you to think of me as being in a situation that the parents of your students may be in, if you are kind of hoping to focus on that younger age group, that K through 12, if you want to work with adults, and I know some of you do already, if you go that way, some of the people that you work with are going to be starting with some perspectives that are really foreign to you. I know someone posted a question that had to do with just how astonishing it is to be doing outdoor education in the wilderness and have someone litter almost as if they didn't even realize that that was a problem. And the question was, how do you approach that? How do you deal with that to meet them where they are? Or is there no point in even trying to meet them where they are? So I want you to know, I believe people do change. I've changed so much in how I fit into my landscape. And that's the point of this story, to get you thinking about, okay, if you're working with people who also are in charge of these little microcosms in the community, what do you do as an educator to bring them in, to expose them to new information, change their thought patterns, change their behaviors? So before I start, if you would just put in the chat, if you know this, do you have an age group that you're particularly interested in working with? Could be K through 12. It could be adults. It could be a special population of adults. You might want to work with ex-military, people who were our former inmates. If you have a special population, go ahead and put that in the chat box. And while you guys are doing that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Cece or Jay, do we have any, since I can no longer see the chat, do we have any special populations popping up in the chat there?
Nothing yet, no.
Okay, that comes to you, put that down. So let's talk about this idea of, as an outdoor educator, you can really change the lens that someone looks through when they see their property, their neighborhood, whether they're a renter or an owner, whether they're in a suburban environment or urban or rural. How can you help homeowners and their families see life before lawn? Because I think that that is something, and you can tell from this picture of my very own front yard, the norm that many people are raised with is this close shave haircut front yard that doesn't support a lot of biodiversity. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We don't want to approach environmental education and outdoor education, with judgment. We go nowhere. So, there are a lot of factors behind that. And a lot of people have a similar situation to my family where there's more than one part of the property. There's this close shaven front yard. There's a backyard that has potential to be different things. And then we also have a behind the fence area that happens to have a tributary to a nearby creek in there. And so that was what we were starting with when we moved into our home a little more than a year ago. And you can see here, this is my daughter, Anna. She is standing in the creek out in the back of our house there. You can see all of the litter from the stormwater that had collected there and a lot of the overgrowth that was there, kind of built up in layers. Most of that overgrowth came from invasive species or aggressive species like English ivy and Virginia creeper. And when we first moved in, we were looking at that not as a natural space that we couldn't wait to enjoy, but almost as a liability. And I think this happens in municipal neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods. When there is a water feature nearby, it can be seen as a danger to young children. It can be seen as a trash heap because of the stormwater runoff that carries the litter down to our nearby creeks and streams. If it's kind of a secluded space, it can be a place where you find signs of drug use. It could be a flood risk, maintenance issues, cosmetic problems, we'll worry about pests. So what we're doing here with this journey and looking at my microcosm is thinking about how do we help the natural native landscape to reemerge. My husband and I knew we had some hazards. We could just leave it alone, right? I mean, that overgrowth provides a habitat for a lot of different critters, so we could just let it be. However, we felt there was a fire hazard, other types of hazards. So in order to get back down to that native seedbed, we decided to remove some of that invasive stuff, clean out the trash. And then we kind of had a space that was clear, but we can't leave it that way. We need to bring back the cover for the habitat. So at this point, the pandemic had started. This is about this time last year, and the weather was just starting to warm up. It was maybe a couple weeks later in the year, and we were having nice weather. We started spending time outside. And I want you now to post in the chat how you help students connect with outdoor space.
In Panica, we have had some at-risk youth and inner city populations, as well as wanting to work with, as well as working with Parks and Rec professionals and providing training to them. And of course, they in turn serve those same populations.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm so happy to hear that, guys. I think one of the most Well, as I think back over my entire career, really the most rewarding experiences happen in places where your average educator may not want to go. I really think that that's because of lack of exposure. I think once we get exposed to diverse situations, we start to see how important outdoor education can be as an influence in those environments. We have a couple of parks here in Greensboro, North Carolina, where the kids say they come home and they say, I'm going to play in the creek. And the creek that they're going to is so heavily littered with needles, empty beer bottles, but that they don't see that. That's their fun place where they play and learn together. So I want you to think now, I'm really glad to know that you guys have so many different populations you're interested in. Think now, how do you help students connect with an outdoor space, whether it's a park, a national park, or a city park?
Go ahead and put it in the chat. Like, what do you think will make it work? We frequently use place-based assignments, like asking people to go in and sit in a space they consider natural, report back on their feelings and their attitudes. That was one, Danica.
Great. All right, if you think of more, put them in the chat. Just because the topic may have moved on, other people are reading that and they want to know, because this is one of the most important things. If we're asking people to change their habits, how they live their life, how they reuse, reduce, recycle, conserve, we need to start with a connection to the natural world. Otherwise, the motivation to change just isn't there. So think about that question, Cheryl, when you get a chance.
Here's another one. Somebody said, I think
Yeah.
play and exploration are a valuable way to get people to connect. And a third person said, giving people the opportunity to experience nature firsthand.
Oh, that's wonderful, wonderful. And you can also bring in virtual tools. You know, in a situation like this where you may not be able to lead your group in person through a space, there are virtual tools like iNaturalist.org, where people can take an inventory of the plants and the wildlife in their space, in their neighborhood, their community, their city. You can see this screenshot here. This is from my area of Greensboro, and there are dots all over this map. And that's because of the strength of the iNaturalist platform. There are a lot of people on this platform all over the world sharing the different species that they find. And you can see here with the eastern box turtle on the right side of the screen, if you were looking at a particular species, if you had a special interest area and you wanted to see where is that species, you know, this is one way to kind of look and see what's around me in my area, what can I invite into my backyard. And now in the chat, if you feel strongly about this, what other tools are out there to help identify wildlife corridors for our species of interest? Now, some of you I know, I'm sure, are familiar with iNaturalist, have profiles on iNaturalist. Feel free to share in the chat also, what do you find valuable about either that platform or other plant and critter ID platforms? What I found useful as a homeowner who was trying to connect to my space was that I could take a picture of something that I found and get an identification suggestion. And then on top of that, experts from all over the world would weigh in and say, oh, well, you're close, but you're not quite there. This is actually this kind of a critter. And so the learning was fantastic. And as a teaching tool, iNaturalist can help us make suggestions to our own students. We can create projects in iNaturalist, and we can control the dates, the locations, which iNaturalist users are able to be in that project. So it can be a great teaching tool as well. So if you haven't already, oh, sorry, Cece, go ahead.
That's fine. So Kate was recommending both Merlin Bird ID, a fantastic, very simple intro, which is great, where they're like, what color is it? What season is it? Where are you? Okay, given that, it's probably one of these four, or the Leaf Snap app. So if you haven't tried those two, those are really great tools as well, so people can get to know place. They allow you to see what's really around us, says Jacob.
Oh, great. Thank you, guys. What about the benefits and the drawbacks of using virtual learning and teaching tools like these?
Do you want us to put that in the chat?
Yeah, if you would. You don't have to answer all these. This is really, if it's been something that you've been thinking about, especially since you all are, I mean, many of you are students or teachers who have had to learn and teach on virtual platforms over the last few months. Did something surprise you as being beneficial in a way you didn't expect? You know, sometimes it's easier for us when we're stressed and frustrated to see the drawbacks of a certain situation, especially when it gets into technical issues. And being nature people, I think that lots of times we want to be outside just enjoying nature and not be caught up in technology. So maybe it's been challenging. Are you seeing anything there in the chat, Cece, as far as benefits and drawbacks yet?
It's saying that it can be a crutch, preventing us from actually going outside. And then someone suggested geocaching to take someone to a new area that was unknown to them. That's a neat way to jump. That was from Jay, jump from place to place. So if you're really comfortable in your own neighborhood, it's like, go across town. Yeah.
I love that. Now, I would have said, and maybe this is how students of yours would feel, or their parents, or your parents, that it may not matter so much, stormwater pollution, other types of pollution, because we're in a suburban environment or a municipal environment, and we don't really expect that to be a bastion of wildlife. There are so many things that we don't see and observe because they're underfoot, under rocks, behind bushes. But what I found when I started taking an inventory of my backyard on iNaturalist were a variety of birds and pollinators, native plants, mammals, all kinds of things that I really did not know were there. Another thing that we can do is to, like Cece earlier, introduce this idea of conservation corridors. And now I'm talking about this microcosm, like one backyard along a stream corridor. But how can you help your students to pull back from looking at this space that they see as being theirs? They own it, it's under their control. They get to make the decisions about how short to cut the lawn, what plants to put in, what plants to take out. How can you get people to pull back and look at the larger area, the larger watershed? And I really am curious, what is your experience as outdoor educators teaching about watersheds, about waterways, about conservation and pollution prevention? I'm really curious if anyone has specialized in water issues or if you're interested in doing so. And certainly I will want to talk with you and touch base during the rest of the conference if you have a particular interest in stormwater, since that's what I do at the Piedmont Triad Regional Council. Yes, Cece.
I just wanted to thank you for that. And you had mentioned that you had the internship through AmeriCorps at the beginning, in case anybody missed that. And I think you've raised so many great questions, Danica. Are we going to transition to maybe a large room? And I want to ask Jay if he thinks breakouts, since there are 20 people, might be a little better. If Jay is still here.
If we're going to do breakouts, people have to know the question before they go in, because they won't be able to see the slide of the question.
Right on. Danica, I didn't want to interrupt you. I just was curious about our transition. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so Cece and I want to hear more about this, about your interests, where you want to go, any questions that you have, and we have some prompts for you. So do we want to go ahead? Because I can stop the presentation right here and we can go ahead and go
No.
into breakout rooms. What do you think?
Keep going, whatever you had in mind, honey. I thought you were at the end.
Oh, no,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So I'm going to take it back here to Cece's point about riparian corridors, conservation corridors. So the question that you can ask your students or ask them to ask themselves, how can I improve the buffer zone that serves as a wildlife highway? It doesn't have to be along a stream like Cece said. This can be a greenway. It can be a pipe that runs under the road. You know, we saw a really large example of that in the video, but I have the same thing on my street. My little creek comes to a roadway. It follows a big concrete conveyance under the road, comes out the other side, and connects to a municipal park. And that is all part of the North Buffalo Creek subwatershed, which is part of the Cape Fear River Basin. And Cece mentioned earlier some great tools like the Natural Heritage Map, where you can really look and see and show folks how much natural area, how much gray or impervious area, as Cece mentioned, is around. You know, what are the roadblocks? What are the challenges that wildlife are facing as they're trying to travel from one place to another? Another thing that we can think about when we're kind of changing the lens from a homeowner who kind of wants to control the landscape and wants a certain color palette to a lens of wanting to nurture the natural landscape, so we can have a lot of discussion about native plants and all the purposes that they serve. Native plants help reduce pollution because they filter the stormwater pollution. They absorb those excess nutrients from the soil, reduces erosion. They require less fertilizer and watering than non-native plants. And of course, for our purposes today, they provide food and shelter and habitat for birds. So I'm curious what your favorite plants are in your areas. I know a lot of you are from North Carolina, but as we saw in the shout out chat, we have folks from California and Michigan. So let us know if you like what your favorite native vegetation is in the chat. And if you really don't know, if you feel that you could use a much wider background in the native plants in your area, or if you end up moving across the country or to another state to work, look for those tools online that help you identify native plants. You can search in North Carolina, the Extension Gardener's Plant Toolbox. This lets you look at what is the best light for my light conditions, for the wildlife I want to attract or repel, for my soil characteristics. This is a really wonderful tool, the Extension Gardener's Toolbox. You can also just use a wildflower seed mix if you want to get things going, but Cece reminds me that there are seeds intermingled in that soil that have been there for a long time that did not have a chance to grow because of the invasive vines like English ivy that had grown over them. So now that some of those invasives are removed with some sun and some water and some time, those native plants are going to reemerge. And, you know, sure enough, over the next couple of months, we put in a couple of things, but things just started to grow. We added a pollinator garden, made a welcome sign for our chipmunks so that they would know we're not going to come after them with rat poison, but we really love having them there and they're not nuisances for us. We were so happy to see ducks in the water. And this is after a couple of months of growth. This is that same bald stream bank that you saw at the beginning, now covered with wildflowers, and we started seeing pollinators and birds. And I realized through that process, as your students will too, and their families will too, that I do have a wilderness in my backyard. I just really had to slow down and reconnect with my landscape in order to see it. And I needed to provide conditions where those natural things could reemerge. So that was my project, my personal project during COVID. And then I decided to translate that, what I learned by using iNaturalist to my own environmental education students. So I started a couple of biodiversity collections on iNaturalist. I found it to be a really wonderful teaching tool. This is the collection that just ended, Bingo by the Creek and Sea. Had over 12,000 observations, more than 2,500 species, almost 1,000 people participating in it. So if you're thinking of starting a project and you want more information about that, let me know. I can do a meetup group for the conference and we can talk about that some more. We're coming to, let's see, it's about 4:33. So let me pause here. Cece, how much time do we have to take a look at the website so they can see what their resources are? Oh, you're muted. I think you're saying it's okay and we have time.
Fine, yeah, go for it. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so because Cece and I have done a couple workshops so that folks can get their environmental education certification in North Carolina, we've already kind of gone through this a couple times where we've told this story, and we at the same time created a Google site so that we could compile all of the resources together so that the links that we're talking about, the maps that we're showing you and all of that are all together in one place, and you can access those. All of the articles that Cece has collected and curated over time are available here. So we wanted to take you to this site, this Google site. And you know what, I meant to copy that and put it in the chat. And I will do that so you can go there yourself. And when you have time, you can just browse through the file box. I'm going to show you here what kind of resources you will see there. So Cece has, from her years of experience in wildlife education and doing outreach, so many different articles about the different critters that we see in North Carolina and how to create a welcoming habitat for them. Cece, is there anything you want to point out in particular on this page, a resource that you find particularly valuable?
The resources, the people in this meeting and everybody who goes to it, send us more and we'll add it to it. And it's evolving over time.
Thank you, Cece. Take a look through here. If there's something you're interested in particular, it's kind of categorized into plants, living in context, child-friendly, and backyard animals. And Cece has a new article that she posted recently. You can download Conservation Gardening, Sustainable Practices for a Healthy Landscape. On the web, we have a lot of the links that we've talked about, link to iNaturalist, and you can pull that up now if you like. Cece and I have been talking for a while. If your brain needs a break from these voices, go ahead and just Google iNaturalist, pull it up, take a look at the map, zoom in on the area where you live and see what's there. If you're interested in Doug Tallamy, you may know him already. Cece also touched on him in the beginning. There are several resources here of Doug's and videos. There are lots of videos of Doug out there, but we picked a couple for you to preview if you want to learn more. Lots of websites, plants, birds. And when we have new workshops, we also post those here. So I'm going to stop now because we need to open it up for questions and discussion and anything that I missed in the chat while I was talking away.
Thank you, Danica. That was awesome. I apologize for interrupting halfway through. Had a brain glitch there.
No, not at all.
All right. Y'all have been awesome listeners, and it's really painful to have a meeting like this and not make it collaborative, because I always adjust my teaching according to the feedback in the room, and it's a pretty lonely silence when we just have to talk straight at you for an hour. So let's just try to unmute and just give us some feedback or give us your thoughts, or why did you come and how does it make sense or not? What would you bring to this? You know, that sort of thing. Let's not do breakout groups right now.
Yeah, I think open discussion. Who has a question or a thought?
That's Paul here. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm going to be able to put so much of this into use. I was looking at the map of the national LCCs, and in clicking on different areas where I am, it says the maps won't load on Google, or Google won't load the maps. And I just wondered, is the South Atlantic far more developed than the rest of the country, and we're waiting for the rest of the country to catch up, or do you know what's happening?
I'm not really up on what's happening across the country. I do know my brother works for NOAA in the Pacific Northwest, and he said their group is pretty active. But what I did was search the LCCs. I was LCC Florida, LCC, Portland, and I could start to find information there. It's through the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's a bit cumbersome. So it does require that you kind of like get their library of connections and then start poking from there. But as far as where people are relative to each other, I'm not up on that. Danica, if you had the questions ready, it might be helpful to have a prompt even for our big group.
Well, have you all been involved of trying to get multiple groups, or just even people coming in that are not associated with, your programs, like an organized bio blitz or anything that was successful in your area?
Yeah, Danica put together a bio blitz, and it was successful, and we put in the link there to the INAT project, but it was very small. It's really a baby step, and this is like how to really grow something from a grassroots level up to size of a continent. I'm not really sure how, but a bunch of people were in that bio blitz. Danica, you can give us some more information on it. It was a ton of fun.
Yes, so I will take this opportunity actually to screen share with you. We just have a couple of minutes left, but I think if I pull it up, how we did the bio blitz, then it's going to give you an idea of how you can do this. So actually, I do need a favor from everybody. I know not everyone responded before, but if you could all just put a yes or a no here if you have a profile on iNaturalist.
And go ahead. I put the link to the conservation corridors in the chat for INAT.
Oh, thank you.
I'm seeing no, yes, no, sadly no. Great, a lot of people, this is new, that's super.
Okay, who said yes?
That was Jay.
Anything you want to say about it?
I mean, I've used it in the past. iNaturalist is, A, for my backyard, B, for several of my classes, but then going to several of the elementary schools and having my students teach the fifth graders how to use iNaturalist. And at that point where people could get together, you'd have like 3 fifth graders with a college student all sharing the same device and exploring in a field was really good. And luckily, we had coordinated with our extension office, and they're looking for invasive species. And so we were able to target where the Chinese privet had kind of taken hold in this big, huge field.
Oh, that is amazing. That is really, really cool. I think for me, actually, this might be easier than trying to log in and pull up each project. I think for me, what I really enjoyed about doing a BioBlitz on iNaturalist, and what surprised me, is during COVID, I had a student email me the first week of the BioBlitz from Alamance. She didn't email me, she messaged me on iNaturalist, which is another reason why I like having it, to let me know that she is immunocompromised. And it was the first time in the pandemic that she felt like she had a purpose to get outdoors. And she ended up the top observer from Alamance County, and she won the biothon. And we had a winner for each county in our 6-county region. So there were things like that that I hadn't really thought about, that it's one of the reasons I think why we see so many people going outdoors now. There's a lot of talk about people getting outside because it is therapeutic. And this has been tough. This year has really been tough for a lot of people. And I think that's why when I did the second biothon on iNaturalist, the participation jumped again especially in one of our counties, Davidson County. And we had several K through 12 teachers who took their students out, not all in the same group. But the beauty of iNaturalist is the kids got the assignment in school and then went home and with their parents went into their backyards and their neighborhood parks and cataloged as many species as they could find. Almost every one of our 12 winners in the last contest were family entrants. They had done this biothon with their children, and it was something that they did together. And it had not been a regular part of their routine before. They started taking walks and just had their phones with them and took pictures of plants and critters. So in that sense, even though it was fairly small compared to the number of students we usually serve, to me, that part of it was a great success.
I don't know what time this session is over. I just have one quick story to share. Are we at 4:45 when we're done?
4:48. I think we're done at 4:50.
Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay. Well, down in Charlotte, there was a woman who started a corridor project for butterflies and the Butterfly Highway. She said that she specifically targeted an African-American community is what she wanted to work with. And they were all planting pollinator plants in their yards, and the butterflies were coming, of course. And she said that one of the community members said to her, the conversation has changed. We go outside now and we see each other. And instead of saying, so-and-so just got out of jail, we say, I just saw this butterfly. Have you seen it yet? And it really, really changed the whole neighborhood. So iNaturalist, but also again, back to the corridor concept, right? And that it's community, we're changing community. And that sort of reflects the purpose of what Danica and I are about.
We have time for questions. Anyone have questions about jobs that Cece and I can address, or anything to do with stormwater or wildlife?
Or comments about why you came and what are your thoughts about how we're going to do this? How are we going to get people to connect?
I know, like I showed up to this because I thought this was an interesting discussion about dealing with like conservation at home, and because I think that's pretty cool, and that's kind of the way to really, I think, help in the largest way is just to get people at home to do what they can do with their own space. And then once they start doing that, everything else becomes a lot easier as far as conservation goes.
Thanks, Jacob. Thank you. I think it is the heaviest lifting, actually. I think it is the hardest work because it is behavior change at an individual level. And it's a whole lot different than bagging peaks and rushing down whitewater rivers, which is really fun. Anybody else?
I want to say thank you for the resources and the website. Those are going to be really helpful. And I know I'll definitely be digging into those as I talk about public land management. And then when we talk about like our private land unit and how they all like I think we just separate those, and like even in like a class they're separate units, you know, but they're not. The land is all connected. And I think I got really excited with your talk because that's something that I think we can do better at, as far as at least in teaching, that we teach these things in units like they're separate when the land is all connected. And I really appreciate how y'all brought that home today.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, that's a really good comment. And I will try to link you through, Rebecca. There's a wonderful presentation by a recent NCSU student who talks about game land use and how when you have multiple uses on the game lands, you actually are going to have more benefit for the local economy. And so we are really struggling as a wildlife agency how to be more inclusive, economically inclusive for protecting wildlands and game lands, because the people paying in for us are our hunters and anglers, but everybody who's out in their boats and paddling their boats, they're not necessarily paying in, so there's no license for that. And so looking at the funding channels for wildlands is also a really important piece of that picture. Private lands, and yeah,